Welcome to Uncertain Things. Here I am again on my own, but joined by, I hate prepositions in English, the one and only Dan Senor, who has become the source of all things Israel for the podcast sphere with his podcast, Call Me Back. He's also the co-author of The Genius of Israel and The Startup Nation. First, I really want to know, we had this conversation in the proverbial green room on how you didn't quite expect the amount of attention and interest that your podcast, Call Me Back, is going to engender. Certainly, you did not expect October 7th to happen, which I assume helped with people seeking explanations, understanding of what is happening in Israel. What I wonder is, do you feel like you have changed by the amount of attention that you got? Do you feel like your role in this world has changed?
First of all, it's great to be with you, Adam. I'm a big fan of your work, all your work. So it's great to have this conversation. Look, what the podcast, if I had sat down and drawn up on a whiteboard a plan and a vision for a podcast, I could have never imagined it to be what Call Me Back has become. And I had a podcast long before October 7th. It was actually something I started during COVID. And Ilan Benatar, who's an Israeli that lives in New York, that I've known for a long time, was producing it with me, for me. And we were focused on a lot of geopolitics, economics, public health issues, and the Middle East would feature prominently in our episodes, although it certainly wasn't on every episode. And then after October 7th, we just, without even actually having a conversation about it, we just pivoted to producing podcast conversations about Israel almost at the beginning, almost every day. And we released our first one on October 8th, and then we just kept going from there. What it had become pretty early on was a way to make Israeli voices communicating to an international audience in English. So Israeli voices in English, Israelis in Israel mostly, by and large. We have some exceptions, but usually there's Israeli voices in Israel. And we try to present the conversation happening inside Israel and how Israelis are thinking about the issues they're contending with, which has now been, we're bumping up against, in a couple of months will be the 2-year anniversary of October 7th. And so the conversation that has been taking place in Israel during that time, we try to present to the extent we can that conversation. And there's obviously, but what we also try to do is present the dilemmas and the challenges that Israelis are contending with as they navigate and try to take their security back and reassert their existence, which was clearly threatened on October 7th. We try to present the dilemmas and the challenges as Israelis navigate everything I'm describing in their own voices. That's what we decided to do. We never actually said this is what we're going to do. It just sort of intuitively, it's what we wound up doing. It was just what we, without actually having a conversation about it, it's just what we did. And then we found that there was a very large audience for it. We just learned over time that what we hear over and over from our listeners over the last couple of years is, and I hear these exact lines over and over. One is, your podcast has kept me sane. I hear that all the time. Or your podcast has prevented me from going crazy. That's one point we hear all the time. Another point is, your podcast has given me community. That people feel that they are the community of listeners of our podcast post October 7th has given them a place where they feel connected to a conversation that is not strident, that is, informative, that is, as I said, presenting the nuance and the internal discussion inside Israel. And that's very valuable to people. So they say. And then it's also been, I think, a valuable tool, again, couldn't have planned for it, for journalists, for mainstream journalists who aren't necessarily Jewish, who aren't necessarily instinctively pro-Israel, but they know now, at least since October 7th, that the issues coming out of Israel and inside Israel are more complicated than they're often presented, and they view our podcast as a way to, obviously I'm pro-Israel. That's my bias. I wear that on my sleeve, but with a somewhat sober take on better understanding the history of some of these issues, the complexity of these issues, and so that's those are the things I've learned along the way as we've been doing it. And then the big surprises include that we not only have a big Jewish audience, and most of our audience is Jewish, but we also have a pretty robust non-Jewish audience. So we have a lot of listeners that are not Jewish throughout the United States and the broader world, but also within the Arab world. We have listeners in places like Saudi Arabia and Egypt. I've been approached by senior government officials, diplomats, say from Saudi Arabia, who have told me that they listen to the podcast all the time. And the reason they do is because it's the only place they feel that they can understand the conversation happening inside Israel. So again, couldn't have planned for that. I wouldn't even known that unless they had come to me and told me that. And then once we were told that, we started doing some research and figured out where a lot of these listeners were in the Middle East. So it's one of the fascinating things about this new media environment we're in, which is you can just experiment with ideas and concepts and see where they go. And there aren't as many gatekeepers as there used to be. And you can find an audience. And we've found an audience. And by the way, I should also add, inside Israel, we have a large following. And that has also been a surprise. Like, I wouldn't have thought an English language podcast would have a huge following in Israel. We are one of the most listened to podcasts inside Israel by Israelis. And, that's why we release the podcast. When we do, we release it at midnight, New York time always, because it's 7 a.m. in Israel, and Israelis are starting their day, and it's how many of them stay on top of what's going on. And often we hear from families in Israel who have loved ones who are either serving in the war or who are, family members of hostages or have other very direct connections to what's going on. And they find the podcast helpful in some way. So as long as they do, we'll keep going.
Interesting you say that people come to you the community immediately can recognize, but the word sane is especially interesting to me because I think that's, especially during COVID when our podcast started on certain things, that was the main response that we were getting. In fact, the one time that I felt like a celebrity was when I was randomly accosted in the streets by a person who said that she recognized my voice because I was probably arguing very loudly as an Israeli. And she said, are you Adam from the podcast? And I said, well, yes. And said, like, you've been keeping me sane. That was, again, that phrase. What do you make of that there is this absence of sanity, that there is a need for sane making products? That's our sign off too. It's a stay sane is our uncertain things sign off for the past 5 years. What do you make of it?
Look, if you are Jewish, and I would say even if you're not Jewish, but let's just say, let's start with the Jewish community, you would have thought after October 7th that the outrage of the world would have been directed at and even unleashed at those who were massacring Jews. And what we all woke up to on October 8th and beyond is that the outrage of the world was not being directed at those massacring Jews. The outrage of the world was being directed at Jews for shockingly objecting to being massacred and
to participate in their own destruction.
Yeah. And that was, I think, for many people, the first moment of insanity, where you're just like, what is going on here? A genocidal attempt was executed against the Jewish people in Israel, and the world's reaction, not the entire world, but many parts of the world, and certainly many parts of the U.S., many parts of the educated United States, was to blame the Jews, to blame Israel for October 7th. And obviously, from that moment on, there's just been this constant stream of reminders that somehow we are to blame for Israel being attacked on October 7th. And somehow we are to blame for this staggering rise in anti-Semitism since October 7th. It's discombobulating. So that's what I think people mean when they say, am I like losing my mind? Am I taking crazy pills here? I think the podcast becomes this space, if you will, where there are real substantive conversations that don't absolve Israel of any blame every time. Certainly there are moments where we have guests on who are critical of different things the Israeli government is doing. But generally speaking, we try to describe what is going on from Israel's perspective. When you do that and try to process it through the lens of how Israelis are looking at it, and then you look at how the world is looking at it, and it's so disconnected, it can make you feel crazy.
It seems that in recent years, and you can attribute that to social media, to the way we consume the world, or to other factors, but it seems like there have been more moments where people's sense of reality has been shattered, and there's been a need for public voices to help reconstruct a sense of order and moral logic in this chaos. The problem is that the competition for reconstructing reality after these moments of breaks has been playing out by many people, by many sides, by many voices. So if you are trying to help, let's say, normie Jews and people who are not viscerally antagonistic to Israel make sense of what's been happening since October 7th and what happened before that led to it, there are other voices doing the same thing from the other side, trying to explain to you why, at minimum, Israel has always been at fault, and the entire Zionist project was as part of the original sin of Western culture, which is colonialism, imperialism. Or at the far end, why even Hitler kind of had the right idea, and our entire perspective, since we have this moments of break in our understanding of the world, maybe we should go back to revisit Churchill. Maybe Churchill was actually the villain of that war. How do you engage in this information warfare in a way that at the same time asserts the authority of history, but also takes advantage of this medium podcasting and new media that kind of relies on the loss of gatekeepers, the opening of the floodgates, right? So we kind of exist in this post-gatekeeping world while trying to assert traditional authority of history, facts, and basic moral standards that we think are still obtain. How do you do that?
I celebrate the removal of many of the gatekeepers. I think we're in a very entrepreneurial time in media. I think, as I said, it's just, if I had said, let's use my podcast as an example. If I had gone to a big media platform and said, I have an idea, it's post-October 7th, I'm going to host a podcast that's going to feature Israeli voices, most of which most of our listeners don't know, whose name, they're not household names, but I'm going to make them household names, but right now they're not household names. And they're going to provide insight and education and context for the news that is coming at us all 24/7 on our devices and elsewhere. We're going to help people get smarter. We're going to make people smarter about what's going on in Israel and the Middle East. And while we're doing that, we're going to provide a community, or help at least augment community for many people in the Jewish community who, even though they're part of community, to some degree in this crazy world, they feel lonely. What do you think? That's my pitch. I would have gotten thrown. People would be like, what? Like, first of all, they would have thought the market is tiny. Second of all, it would have been very hard to prove that there was a market for what I was describing.
Without experimenting.
But the nice thing about this environment we're in now is all you need is a laptop and a microphone, and you can start creating content and push it out and see and then you can see if you can validate your thesis and see if there's a market, or you can, as I did, is you just kind of figure it out as you go along. So that's, to me, extremely exciting, and it creates opportunities for podcasts like mine and yours and others to, serve the audience that may not be obvious to big media executives that exists. That's the upside. The downside is you have podcasts that are pumping out a lot of content and that are in need of a lot of guests and a lot of voices, and they want quote unquote unique guests and distinctive guests. And so they seek out more and more what I think ultimately become fringier and fringier personalities, so that their podcast is the only place you're going to hear that fringy voice on, because that person isn't making the rounds and doesn't appear everywhere. So the person seems obscure and interesting. Well, they may be obscure and interesting for a reason, because they're crazy. They articulate views that are, just completely at odds with history. So that's the downside. The no gatekeepers means no gatekeepers, and it can cut both ways. I'm not saying this is purely a glorious time and, it only benefits those who are being responsible. The challenge is it does allow for the elevation of voices that are also irresponsible. I mean, my view is the latter is going to happen no matter what. So why not flood the zone to the extent that we can with responsible voices and responsible conversations, and that inform and educate in a serious-minded way to at least balance out some of the crazy. The crazy will be there no matter what.
So what would be your approach when people elevate the likes of Daryl Cooper to...
It's exactly what I was thinking of when I was speaking.
Redefine what history is, but do you engage with that new narrative that has now been put out there on some of the biggest platforms, right? Whether it's Joe Rogan, who I think fits into your story of needing fringier and fringier guests, or Tucker Carlson, who I think is much more intentional in the sort of voices that he's putting on. But either way, now you have Holocaust revisionism inspired by David Irving out in the open. Do you engage it, or do you ignore it and but by engaging it, you're giving it more succor?
It's a really good question. My inclination is to not engage it and to not start getting into historical debates or debates about history that is like a case closed. I can give some of these arguments being raised by people who are turning history on its head. My inclination is to just not even engage it and then just be providing responsible, straightforward content. That's my view now. That's been my view for some time. I don't know if it's sustainable. At some point, maybe you've got to engage it. But I haven't seen how people who try to go on these platforms to kind of correct the record are actually successful, because I don't believe most of these hosts of the platforms, and there are some exceptions, but I don't think most of them, of the podcasts and other platforms that are platforming these very dangerous voices, I don't believe that they're acting in good faith. So it's not like you're going to go on one of these shows and actually be able to make your case. I think there are some exceptions, but I'm skeptical that you can really engage it directly.
So I'm going to go back to this topic when we talk more about Israel and the way it's been clearly losing the messaging war around the world. But I want to start by level set. You, as the titles of your books suggest, very, very bullish on the Jewish state. You fully go long on the Jewish state. I have to ask, as an Israeli who, Israelis, as you know very well, feel like every year it might be the last year of our little experiment. What would make you bearish about it?
What would make me bearish about Israel?
Yeah. What would be a red flag?
That's a very easy question for me to answer. Okay. Because I know why I'm so bullish on Israel. So now, so it's a very simple input. So all I have to do is just say if that input were not there. So I'm going to tell you why I'm bullish on Israel. If I had to strip everything away, and I can go through, my most recent book, The Genius of Israel, my co-author and I really go through why we think Israel is the healthiest society in the world. Okay, and I mean that healthy. It's not physically, although they're physically healthy too, but I mean societally healthy. Why Israel is probably one of the 2 or 3 best places in the world to start a family and raise children. There are a number of factors that we lay out why we think Israel is basically an outlier relative to all the demographic trends, all the kind of economic facts of life that we just take for granted, that we just assume are constants. Israel, it contradicts all of them, the Israeli experience. At a very high level, young Israelis believe that they are part of something larger than themselves, on balance. I mean, I'm not saying every single one, but the society inculcates this ethos. They're part of something. They're part of a community that's larger than themselves. They're part of a society that's larger than themselves. They're part of a history that's larger than themselves. They're part of, God willing, a future that is larger than themselves, and they feel a part of it. They feel they can touch it. They feel that they can shape it. They're not just observers. And you see this ethos manifest itself in many ways, very concrete ways, not the least of which is most Israelis, as we now know, as we've seen, give up 3 to 4, if not long or vital years of their lives, even in peacetime, for public service, to serve in the military. Israelis are part of a national calendar, a civic calendar that's a religious-based calendar that connects lives, their schedule, their week to week, their time, to something that is based on their religion, that's based on their history. But even if they're not religious people, there's a sense of something bigger going on that they're connected to. Spend time in Israel, as I'm sure you have, on Yom HaTzmaut, on Israel's Independence Day, and Yom HaZikaron, Israeli Memorial Day, which are back-to-back. Something I've always thought should exist here in the United States, where the Memorial Day bleeds into Independence Day. So there's a real sense that Israeli independence is not something Israelis take for granted. They have their independence and freedom and security because of the sacrifices of the people that are honored literally the day before, right? Memorial Day goes right into Independence Day. And on Memorial Day, there are nationwide sirens that go on across the country where Israelis, no matter who they are or what they're doing, they stop what they're doing for those 2 minutes and stand in a moment of silence, whether they're in schools or restaurants or hotels or meetings or wherever, on buses, on highways. They get out of their cars, they get out of their buses, they get out of their buildings, and they just stand silently for 2 minutes. And it's both a personal experience, meaning they're thinking about loved ones they've lost personally, but they also are thinking about this collective sacrifice that they are a part of. We have a chapter in our book called Thanksgiving Every Week, which is what we describe Shabbat in Israel. I ask Americans all the time, tell me one ritual where you feel that it's sacrosanct for you. It's very important on that day for you to be with your family, your friends, people closest to you. And not only are you experiencing it, but almost everyone else in your country, in your society, or your community are experiencing the same thing in their homes at that exact same time. And they always, whenever I pose this question, they always say this, they say Thanksgiving, America's, Thanksgiving, and they're right. And then I say, all right, name a second one. And that's where they usually get stuck. The closest they can come to is to mention the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl is like a national ritual. I know it sounds funny. Whereas in Israel, it's every Friday night, every Shabbat. Whether you're religious or you're not very observant, there's a sense that life slows down for everybody. And people generally are with the people closest to them on Friday nights. It's a religious-based experience that has now civic impact. It's almost like Thanksgiving in that sense, which is a secular holiday. Here, it has a religious dimension and a secular dimension. Whatever it is to you, it is an experience you are having with the people closest to you, and that the whole country is participating in as well at that exact time. So I give you example after example after example where Israelis feel a connection that this is all about something larger than yourself, larger than your own advancement, larger than viewing yourself as a human resume, larger than having relationships that are purely instrumental relationships. You're part of something that's meaningful and that's purpose-driven. That is why I think Israelis have so many babies. That's it's not the only reason, but it's a big reason because they're part of something larger. It's why, Israel's the only country in the world, I think, that I know of that when it was under siege and a war started, in the weeks and months after the war started, its population expanded rather than shrank, because all these Israelis that were living abroad were not running in the opposite direction. They're trying to get on planes to get back to Israel. It's why so many Israelis I know who leave Israel and say, oh, I'll go work in the United States, for a little bit. I'll go work in Silicon Valley. I'll do whatever. And then when they have kids, they want to go back to Israel because they want their children to be back, part of that experience. They want their children to serve in the army. I have plenty of Israeli friends who could be living a very cushy life in New York City or Los Angeles or the Bay Area, but they move back to Israel so their kids can serve in the military. It's an amazing thing. And I don't want to make it sound like it's all just kind of a collectivist enterprise. It's not. Paul Johnson, who's one of my intellectual heroes, the great historian, British historian, and he's written these books like about different histories of different peoples. And he wrote a book, it was iconic. It was the history of the Jews, the history of the Jewish people, but not Jewish. He's not Jewish. And he was being interviewed many years ago by the late Jonathan Sacks, Lord Jonathan Sacks, former chief rabbi of the UK. And Sacks said to Johnson, he said, you've studied and you've written histories of all these different people. So what would you say is the one thing that's most distinctive about the Jewish people relative to everyone else And he said, there are peoples and societies in the world that are collectivist. He's thinking about like Eastern societies and Eastern culture. And then there are cultures and societies that I've studied, he said, that are highly individualistic. And those are obviously more Western. He said, the Jewish people are the only people I've ever studied where there's actually a balanced blend between those two. They sense that, yes, it's not that they're less committed to individual excellence. It's not that they're not ambitious. Certainly you look at Israel's tech scene, you can't help but think these are very ambitious people and who they want to accumulate wealth, God willing, and they should have it. They should have at it and have much success. But they have that, and yet it's balanced with the sense of being a part of something larger than just their own individual success. And that is the magic of Israel. For all these reasons, but especially that last person, I find young Israelis some of the most inspiring and interesting people in the world. And so as long as Israel has that, I'm bullish. If you suddenly, Adam, tell me that, well, Israelis in large numbers don't want to serve in the army anymore. Or if you told me, yeah, Israel was under attack again, but all these Israelis that were living in the diaspora, they didn't want to come back and help defend their country. They just decided, oh, wow, I dodged a bullet. I'll stay put. I'll stay where I am. I'm not going back to Israel. Or if you told me that, a bunch of Israelis who, moved elsewhere and had children and said, wow, life is much better abroad than back in Israel. So I don't want to, I'm going to stay put. I would get bearish about Israel because I think Israel is a magnet for its own talented young people. They want to be there. They want to be a part of it. They want to build it. And if suddenly that allure, for whatever reason, withered, I would become really bearish. Because it's a country that doesn't have, as you know, natural resources, at least at scale, to speak of. All they have are their people. And if their people aren't committed, and they're very talented people, if they're not committed to the enterprise that is building the modern Jewish state, there's no modern Jewish state.
Yeah, no, I think it fits into an argument that I've been having with a number of people from different perspectives about things like Israel's commitment to its identity, to the identity of the IDF as a moral army, for instance. That's a big cliche in Israel. We see our army as the most moral army in the world. It's a people's army, but it also tries to be exceedingly ethical by global standards. And that sense of exceptionalism that often leads to immediate destruction. Some of the sacrifices that Israel has made, for instance, trading prisoners by a giant factor for every hostage that Hamas has taken over the years, has led us down moral hazardous paths. And sometimes people say we need to get over our childish commitments to these ideas about morality and be more practical, be more Machiavellian. And I always wonder if that would come at the expense of the ethos that leads people to participate in the army in the first place. So the immediate practical benefit of maybe sending a signal to Hamas that we are not going to play along anymore and you can kidnap as many people as you want. We're not negotiating with genocidal monsters. But the result of that would lead to a break within the Israeli soul that would lose the one real advantage that we have.
Look, the last almost 2 years now have revealed so many dilemmas and conundrums and test of values, really, for Israelis and for the Jewish people. And I think you're zeroing in, Adam, on, if I had to, like, the most difficult one, and the most difficult one to explain, by the way, to people who aren't from our world, which is the lengths Israel will go to get hostages back. It's like people don't understand it. They're like, well, if you just send a message, you're not negotiating with hostage takers anymore, with terrorists anymore. Let me put it differently. Israel negotiates for these lopsided hostage deals like you're describing. I mean, the most extreme example was the exchange for Gilad Shalit. So Israeli soldier taken hostage for a few years. In 2011, Israel negotiates for his release and releases from its prisons 1,027 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons to get back one soldier.
Including Yahya Sinwar, who is almost a symbolic, horrific narrative payoff to this dilemma.
The architect of October 7th, the Osama bin Laden, if you will, of Israel's October 7th, was released. He would have been in a prison had Israel not done that deal. So what do we know? We know when Israel does these deals, two things happen. One, it releases people who have Israeli blood on their hands, who have Jewish blood on their hands. It releases them back into the terrorist ecosystem, if you will, to live another day, as we saw from Sinwar, to wage another massacre. So you're just releasing, there's a reason they're in Israeli prisons. So they can't do more damage and can, wage more violence. So you're letting them out to live and fight another day, A. B, you're incentivizing future hostage taking because you are sending a message, hey, this works, right? There's a reason why Hamas on October 7th took 250 plus hostages, because they know as a tool of warfare against Israel, maybe not against other countries, but against Israel, that it works. From a purely clinical perspective, it makes no sense to do these lopsided hostage deals, except for the following. One, I think you're right. The moment you tell a society that depends so heavily on its people, on its young people, willing to serve, willing to fight to defend the country, often in very dangerous parts of the world, parts of the region, that you may get taken hostage, you may be captured, and it's not clear whether or not Israel will go to the ends of the earth to bring you back. Does that change the ethos of the society? I mean, there's no question it does. The question is to what degree, and could the society recover? I mean, that's a debate to have, and there's obviously a lot of views on this in Judaism. And you go back, not just in the modern state of Israel, in Jewish religion, in Jewish debates about these questions, about the lengths you go to bring back a hostage, a captive. But secondly, if you want to just think strategically, Netanyahu, when he was prime minister for the Gilad Shalit deal, and we now know that one of the reasons he did the deal, because including many of his most senior advisors, thought, look, we understand the lengths you want to go to get Gilad Shalit back, but this deal is crazy. I mean, there were some people, I mean, I have friends who had loved ones who were killed by terrorists long before October 7th. Nothing to do, who were outraged because people, family members, friends who were killed were the terrorists behind those executions were released in the Gilad Shalit deal. So there were many around Netanyahu that were saying, this is crazy, this deal. It's so lopsided. And the understanding then was, it looked increasingly like then, it was a different time, but it looked increasingly likely then that Israel at least was seriously considering a military operation against Iran to take out Iran's nuclear program. And Netanyahu knew that if he was going to ask Israeli pilots to fly over Iran while there was a hostage being held by an enemy, the morale of those Israeli pilots being asked to fly over Iran and conduct this operation would not be as high as it otherwise would be if they knew, hey, I could be shot down and maybe they'll just leave me there to suffer. So it's as much about Jewish and Israeli values as it is, there is a very practical element to it too. I can argue very practically, as I did before, the two reasons why you shouldn't do these deals, but you can also make a very practical strategic argument why you should do them.
What do you make of the irony that ultimately the attack on Iranian nuclear facilities did happen with not one, but almost 30 probably living hostages still in Gaza?
Well, look, I think Israel has been, over the last 20 months now, demonstrating, I know that there are big debates on this, but on balance, Israel has been going to extraordinary lengths, both the military operations to release hostages, the two hostage deals it's done have been completely lopsided. I mean, the ratio of Palestinian prisoners in each of those deals that were released from Israeli prisons in order to get hostages back, Israeli hostages back, the pause in fighting that was clearly worked against Israel's immediate security interest to pause the fighting for X number of days in order to get the hostages back. It certainly meant that if Israel were to resume fighting, which it did in both cases, the fighting would be more dangerous because Hamas would get that breather, that pause. So I do think, and I know there's a lot of heated debate inside Israel about this, but I do think about whether or not the Israeli government has done everything it could. But I just think on balance, the message to those Israeli pilots is, look what Israel is constantly doing and constantly wrestling with and constantly trying to accomplish in these hostage deals.
In the immediate aftermath of October 7th, I had a conversation with Jonah Goldberg on his podcast, and I remember laying down how I think things are going to roll out, both domestically and internationally for Israel. And sadly, most of it was correct, especially the global response. But my most controversial, I think, take was that I was worried, and Jonah was much more on the optimistic side, I would say, but I was really worried that the experience and what Israel has to do after October 7th would darken Israeli soul, if you want to be poetic about it, but it would lead to a different sense of what it means to be in Israel, to participate in the IDF. It would inevitably be darker, which quite reasonably is the plan of a terrorist organization like Hamas. It is partially to turn your enemy into the monsters we want you to be in the eyes of the world. And to some extent, the war in Gaza has redefined Israeli understanding of itself, right? And what lengths we're willing to go to when we are hurt. I don't think these images coming out of Gaza would have been something tolerated publicly in Israel before October 7th. And now, still the majority of the public says, no, this is what needs to be done. We need to uproot this evil, and we will not let anything stop us. What do you make of that? Is that a change in the Israeli soul, an expansion of its capacity for darkness, or?
I think war is ugly. That's what I think. I think war is ugly. I think every kind of war is ugly. I think defensive wars that Israel's fighting, even defensive wars, are ugly. I think no matter how good a society is and how well-meaning and how compassionate a society is, and I say all those things about Israel, there's no question that when a society has to go to war, it loses a little bit of its innocence. It's just you can't do the things you need to do in war and not lose a little bit of your innocence. That's okay. I mean, sadly that's okay, because that's necessary for war. But people who raise these concerns, whether they're in Israel or more prominently and more commonly outside of Israel, who say these things about Israel, I simply say the following. One, your frustration with what Israeli warfighting looks like and what Israelis must participate in order to defend their country is not a criticism. It's a sentiment. If it were an actual real criticism, then you would have an alternative to present. You would say, oh, you're doing this. I think you're doing it wrong. You should do it this way. That's like a real criticism. So my friend, General David Petraeus, who I worked with in Iraq, who, he has some, I'm just using him. I was just communicating with him in the last few days. He has some criticisms of how Israel, the war fighting strategy. That is not a sentiment. That is not like, oh, it's terrible what Israel's doing. It's, I understand what Israel's trying to accomplish. I've had to deal with similar things in my military career, so says Petraeus. They're doing it the wrong way. Here's the way they should do it. But to just wag your finger at Israel, whether you are doing it from outside Israel or you're from within Israel, but again, it's more of an issue from outside of Israel, is without an alternative, what's your substitute? So Israel has an alternative. Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005. Israel pulled out full stop from Gaza in 2005 and said, Palestinians, it's yours. We're done with it. Do with it what you may. We are not going to get involved. We're not going to micromanage. We're not going to administer it. Our military won't be there. As I say in Yiddish, sei gesund. You're on your own. Okay. So after October 7th, Israel could do another version of that. It could say, that's it. We're done. We're out. Unfortunately, nobody really thinks that's a realistic option now, given what Israel saw had been built up from the summer of 2005 to October 7th, 2023. It's no longer viable for an Israeli leader to say, yeah, we're just going to do what we did in 2005 again. We had to fight this war after October 7th, but we're going to go back to 2005. We're just going to be done with it and seal up our border, and be done. So that's not realistic. Okay. The other alternative is to go back to pre-disengagement, pre-2005, and say, you know what? We're going to totally reoccupy Gaza. We're just going to completely, I'm not going to say annex it, but we're going to totally reoccupy. We're going to be in total control of Gaza. We're going to be everywhere. We're going to administer it from civilian functions. Our military presence is going to be everywhere. We are taking over Gaza again. Does the international community think that's a good idea? Absolutely not. Do Israelis think it's a good idea? Absolutely not. So let's take that off the table. So where does that leave us? That leaves us with Israel trying to figure out how not to completely disengage from Gaza like it had in 2005, because that's not realistic, and not re-engage Gaza the way it had before 2005, from 1967 to 2005. So it's stuck in this mucky, ugly middle, which is probably what it's going to be like for some time. Obviously, God willing, not like the war like we're seeing it, but Gaza is going to be a mess for Israel for some time. Once we're talking responsibly, that is like the reality, can we just talk about the reality? That's like the reality. So now if you want to have a discussion about what is the best way to do that mucky middle, okay. So then now we're having a real discussion about what's operationally feasible and what's not. But that's a real conversation versus what I call a sentiment, which is just throwing up your hands and saying it's terrible what Israelis have had to do and what they're doing in Gaza. They shouldn't do that. Okay.
You have some insight into both Israeli and political. You have some insight into both the Israeli administration and the American administration, or at least their thinking. Was it yesterday? 2 days ago, Netanyahu and Trump met to talk about the end game for Gaza. There's been no official statements that concluded where we are on the current ceasefire deals. What do you think? Where do you think we're going, and what would you like to see?
I think that Israel has had extraordinary successes militarily. I think Gaza, Hamas is a shadow of itself. Does not have the manpower, the sophistication, the chain of command, the munitions to wage anything, not even close to what the threat it posed, on the eve of October 7th. So I don't want to say Hamas is decimated. It's not, but it's the threat of Hamas is, like I said, I don't want to say it's non-existent, but it's barely there. I think that Israel has had extraordinary success in systematically taking out the proxy system around the Middle East. Obviously, Hezbollah has gotten the most attention, but it's put pressure on other proxies in the region. It has, the Assad regime, which had been in power for 53 years, is now gone. Which was a proxy state of Iran. Iran itself has lost this proxy system that it invested billions of dollars and years in building up. It doesn't really have a conventional military to speak of its own. It doesn't have any air defense anymore. The U.S. and Israel have total control over Iranian skies. It certainly doesn't have a nuclear program, at least not now. And it has a hapless economy that's like basically a mess, and an internal population, a domestic population that is, let's just say at a minimum, is not unified in its support of the regime. So Israel has transformed the Middle East in the last some 20 months in a way that I don't think its geopolitical position has been this transformed to such a favorable degree in any time in Israeli history, going back all the way to the Six-Day War. That would be the other time that I could see, this kind of transformation. That historians will point to.
I can add that the Israeli markets are reflecting this optimism because they have been going wild over the past month.
Right. I think if there was ever a moment to begin to wind down its war in Gaza, this is certainly an inflection point. This is certainly a period to do it. Now, how you do it, back to my earlier point, I think Israel will need to maintain some security presence in Gaza in certain corridors and that you hear being talked about in the press. And I think they should insist on that. I think Israel cannot commit or must, I think whatever final agreement there is, cannot have Hamas in power in any way. Now, how you actually enforce that is, so these are all questions that have to be worked out. They're basic security thresholds that need to be met for Israel. But that said, if there was ever a time, I believe, to begin that process, it's now. And I also think it's important because Israeli society, and specifically the Miluim, the reserve service soldiers, the community of reservists, they're serving 100, 200, 300 days. I'm sure you know plenty of people who've been serving. I have plenty of friends and family members who have served. And the Israeli military was never structured for this kind of extended period of fighting over several years, deploying this many people. I mean, just think about it. How many, over 300,000 Israelis have been called up as a percentage of Israel's population. It's comparable to the numbers, but bigger, actually, larger, if you extrapolate out to the American, the call-ups of American soldiers during the Second World War. That's the toll that's being taken on Israeli society. It's a bigger commitment from the population at large than what America experienced during the Second World War. And with a military, in the case of Israel, that's not equipped to handle that. It was always supposed to fight short wars, the IDF, mostly away games, not wars on its own borders. It's just a lot. And I think the pressure needs to be relieved. Obviously, if there's a security crisis and that needs to be reactivated, it can. But it strikes me that now is a good time, provided certain thresholds are met. And I think that's the crux of the negotiations going on right now in Doha and in Washington as we're recording this.
How do you balance as an Israeli who has many internal criticisms in both directions, towards the left and the right in Israel, but has, like every Israeli, vibrant and often antagonistic opinions. And yet on the world-facing American side, there's fear that every time that internal criticism is being sounded in Israel, it will be exploited by her enemies in some kind of manipulative way to sow distrust or to make cheap political points to undermine its legitimacy. How do you, as a public influencer, balance these conflicts, these contradictions?
It's something I wrestle with all the time. And it's often, and the reason is it's often very frustrating to me because I will go on TV in the US, I will make the case for Israel, and I will defend against criticisms of Israel. And then the anchor, whoever's interviewing me, will say, well, Dan, this criticism that you're referring to, that you're calling unfair, it's not just critics from over here that are issuing those charges against Israel. It's Israeli citizens that are on Kaplan Street in Tel Aviv that are making those arguments, which is obviously a fair point. All I know is what I can control about me and the role I play and the life I lead. Okay. I do not live in Israel. I'm not an Israeli citizen. I have lots of family members. I care a lot about Israel. I feel very connected to it, but I do not live there. I do not vote for Israeli governments. I don't pay taxes in Israel. Like I'm not, my sons are not serving in the Israeli army. Like if those things were true, then I would be probably part of the intra-Israel debate and have real skin in the game. But I don't. I am presenting Israel's perspective to the world in these discussions when I'm involved with these discussions. And the only question I ask is, are you, the outside world, holding Israel to a different standard than you hold any other country? That's it. It's not to say you can't criticize the government. It's not to say you can't think the government does stupid things.
No, but by challenging it, before I let you go, I need you to answer the actual challenging part, which is, we know Israel is being held to a different standard. We are savvy enough with the way that the American left-leaning media will look at Israel. And we know how institutions like the UN will look at Israel. And we know that every single article that comes out from Haaretz will be gobbled up by, and I work for Haaretz. I respect its place in the Israeli ecosystem. It has a place, especially the Hebrew side. But certainly from the English side of Haaretz, you know that everything that will be published will then be used in the ammo of Israel's haters as part of their big I don't know what to call it, as part of their big anti-Israel machine that we know is a different standard than any other regime in the world. So we know that this is happening. But so what do? Neither of us wants to suppress the internal conflict, but also I do not want Dave Smith to be quoting Haaretz articles. So
or quoting Ehud Olmert, which is
quoting Ehud Olmert, right? And so, how do you deal with this contradiction in yourself as somebody who's translating the Israeli conversations to Americans?
Look, what I say to Israeli friends of mine who are very critical of Israel, of their own government, is, and whose statements and comments can be used to inveigh against Israel by Israel's critics. I just caution them, and obviously they can do whatever they want, but I would hope in their criticisms of different decisions that the Israeli government is making that they can contextualize it and say, on balance, Israel is fighting a just war. Right? That is their criticism, by the way. Their criticisms of Israel is that Israel is not fighting a just war, that Israel has no business, trying to defeat Hamas. That is basically what they're saying, or defeat its enemies, or at least restore some kind of deterrence. That's their basic argument. And then they will cite Israeli critics of the government to make their point. And my response to both the Israeli critics and the external critics is, well, I think the Israeli critics would agree with me that Israel's a vibrant democracy. In a vibrant democracy, you will have people inside the society, internal critics who are passionately debate what their government is doing. But I think you'd be hard-pressed to find an Israeli citizen, including some of the most fierce critics from inside Israel, who question, of course you could probably find one. There are outliers, but on balance, most would say, of course Israel's doing what it has to do. Even if we disagree with this or disagree with that. Of course Israel has Adam, to me, the most glaring example of this was, look at the people who were protesting on Kaplan Street against the government week after week on Saturday nights. Hundreds of thousands of people. Many of those people who were protesting on Kaplan Street against the government were the same people in cockpits of Israeli Air Force planes flying over Iran at the direction of this Israeli government that they loathe. And they didn't have to do it, by the way. They could have said, I'm a conscientious objector. I can't serve under this government. I despise this government. I don't trust this government. I'm leaving my country. I'm leaving. They could have done that. They didn't. So on the one hand, they're there protesting on Saturday nights. And then on Sunday night, they're flying over Iran, conducting a military action against, under the direction of this government that they're deeply critical of. So they managed to strike this balance. And I think on the big picture themes that have become the crux of these debates about Israel internationally, I think most Israelis, including many who are very critical of the government today, would still agree and defend Israel on these big themes.
Dan, Senor, thank you so much. I could go for another hour, but
We'll have to do another episode. We'll have to do another episode. But it's 4:44 and I got to make calls to Israel. People are calling me and it's 7 hours ahead, as you know. So talk about people wagging fingers at me. They'll be wagging fingers at me if I don't return their calls.
Wagging their Jewish fingers at you.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Dan.
All right. Thanks, Adam. Enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. Follow us on uncertain.substack.com or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're feeling generous, give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and share us with your friends and enemies. Until next time, stay sane.
That was a lot.